Elizabeth Holmes was born into privilege in Washington, D.C. in 1984. From an early age, she showed signs of ambition that would later define her life. Her father worked for government agencies, and her mother was a congressional committee staffer. Elizabeth grew up believing she was destined for greatness. As a child, Elizabeth had an unusual fear. She was terrified of needles. This fear would later become central to her biggest lie. She often told people that watching her grandfather struggle with cancer treatments inspired her mission to revolutionize healthcare. But those who knew her well said Elizabeth was more inspired by fame and fortune than helping sick people. In high school, Elizabeth was known for her intense personality. She would practice lowering her voice to sound more authoritative. She read business magazines instead of novels and talked constantly about becoming the next Steve Jobs. Her teachers remember her as smart but obsessed with being seen as a genius. When Elizabeth got accepted to Stanford University in 2002, she seemed to have everything going for her. Stanford was one of the most prestigious schools in America. She studied chemical engineering and seemed destined for success. But Elizabeth had other plans. In her sophomore year, Elizabeth made a decision that would change everything. She decided to drop out of Stanford and start her own company. She was only 19 years old, but she believed she had an idea that would make her rich and famous. Elizabeth's idea was simple but revolutionary. She wanted to create a machine that could run hundreds of blood tests using just a single drop of blood from a finger prick. No more painful needles. No more taking multiple vials of blood from patients. Just one drop, and you could test for everything from diabetes to cancer. She called her company Theranos, combining the words therapy and diagnosis. Elizabeth believed this name sounded scientific and important. She started the company in 2003 with big dreams and even bigger promises. The problem was that Elizabeth had no idea how to actually build such a machine. She had dropped out of college after just 2 years. She had no advanced training in medicine or engineering, but she was convinced that her vision and determination would be enough. Elizabeth began pitching her idea to investors. She wore black turtlenecks every day, copying Steve Jobs' signature style. She practiced speaking in an unnaturally deep voice, thinking it made her sound more serious and trustworthy. She created detailed presentations showing how her technology would work. The investors were impressed. Here was a young, confident woman promising to revolutionize healthcare. The blood testing industry was worth billions of dollars, and if Elizabeth could really do what she claimed, everyone would get rich. In 2004, Elizabeth raised her first $1 million. Then $5 million. Then $20 million. Investors kept giving her money based on her promises, even though she hadn't built a working machine yet. With millions of dollars in funding, Elizabeth moved Theranos into a large office building in Palo Alto, California. She hired scientists, engineers, and business executives. She decorated the offices with expensive furniture and hung inspirational quotes on the walls. But there was a problem. Despite having some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley working for her, nobody could figure out how to make Elizabeth's vision work. The laws of science and physics made it nearly impossible to run hundreds of accurate tests from a single drop of blood. Elizabeth's reaction to this setback revealed her true character. Instead of admitting the technology wasn't ready, she decided to fake it. She told her employees that they needed to keep their work completely secret. She divided the company into different sections and made sure employees in one section couldn't talk to employees in another section. Elizabeth created a secret lab within the company. Only a few trusted employees were allowed inside. She told investors and board members that this was where the magic happened. She called her fake machines Edison devices, after the famous inventor Thomas Edison. The truth was very different. Inside the secret lab, there were no revolutionary machines. Instead, Theranos used traditional blood testing machines made by other companies. These machines required large amounts of blood, just like every other lab in the world. When patients came to Theranos for blood tests, the staff would take a tiny drop of blood from their finger. But then they would secretly dilute this blood with saline solution to make it seem like there was more. Sometimes they would take blood from the patient's arm using traditional methods, while pretending it was just a finger prick. By 2010, Elizabeth had raised over $100 million, but her company still hadn't produced a working product. Any normal person would have admitted failure and tried to return the investors' money. But Elizabeth was not normal. She was addicted to the attention and respect that came with being seen as a genius. Elizabeth began appearing on magazine covers and television shows. She gave speeches at medical conferences and technology events. She spoke about her vision of making healthcare accessible to everyone. She said her technology would soon be available in every pharmacy and grocery store in America. The media loved Elizabeth's story. Here was a young woman who had dropped out of Stanford to change the world. She was blonde, articulate, and wore those mysterious black turtlenecks. Journalists called her the next Steve Jobs and the world's youngest female billionaire. Elizabeth hired famous politicians and business leaders to serve on her board of directors. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger joined the board. So did former Secretary of Defense James Mattis and former Secretary of State George Shultz. These were some of the most respected people in America, and their involvement made Theranos seem legitimate. But none of these famous board members had any background in medicine or science. They didn't understand how blood testing worked, and they never asked difficult questions about the technology. They were impressed by Elizabeth's confidence and believed her promises without demanding proof. Elizabeth also hired expensive public relations firms to manage her image. She appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time magazines. She was invited to speak at prestigious conferences around the world. She became a celebrity in Silicon Valley and beyond. By 2013, Theranos was valued at over $9 billion. Elizabeth owned more than half the company, making her worth over $4 billion on paper. She was listed as one of the richest women in the world, even though her company had never made a profit and had never proven that its technology actually worked. Elizabeth lived like a billionaire. She hired personal security guards and traveled in private jets. She moved into expensive homes and wore designer clothes. She dated a man named Ramesh Sunny Balwani, who became her business partner and helped her maintain the deception. Sunny was 20 years older than Elizabeth and had made money during the dot-com boom of the 1990s. He had no medical background either, but Elizabeth put him in charge of the lab operations at Theranos. Together, they created a culture of secrecy and fear within the company. Employees who asked questions about the technology were fired. Scientists who expressed concerns about patient safety were silenced with legal threats. Elizabeth and Sunny monitored employee emails and phone calls. They created an atmosphere where people were afraid to speak up about problems. Despite all the secrecy, some employees began to realize that something was seriously wrong. The blood test results were inconsistent and often inaccurate. Patients were getting test results that could lead to wrong medical decisions. Some employees quit rather than be part of what they saw as a dangerous fraud. Elizabeth responded to these concerns by hiring expensive lawyers to intimidate former employees. She made them sign agreements promising never to talk about what they had seen at Theranos. She threatened to sue anyone who spoke out against the company. While Elizabeth was getting rich and famous, real patients were being harmed by Theranos' fake technology. The company had partnered with Walgreens Pharmacy to offer blood tests in stores across Arizona and California. Thousands of patients trusted Theranos with their health. The problem was that the test results were often wrong. Some patients got results saying they were healthy when they were actually sick. Others got results saying they had serious diseases when they were perfectly fine. These incorrect results led people to get unnecessary medical treatments or to miss treatments they actually needed. One patient got test results suggesting she might be having a heart attack. She rushed to the emergency room in panic, only to find out the results were wrong. Another patient got results suggesting he had a serious blood disorder and spent months worried about his health before discovering the test was inaccurate. Elizabeth knew about these problems, but she continued to expand the business. She was more concerned about maintaining her image and raising more money than about patient safety. She told employees that the problems would be fixed eventually, but that they needed to keep operating while they worked on improvements. The truth was that Elizabeth had no plan for how to fix the technology because it was fundamentally impossible. You cannot run hundreds of accurate blood tests from a single drop of blood, no matter how advanced your machine is. Elizabeth was asking her employees to achieve something that violated the laws of physics. In 2013, a young man named Tyler Leach started working at Theranos. Tyler was actually the grandson of George Shultz, one of the famous politicians on Theranos' board of directors. Tyler was smart, idealistic, and genuinely wanted to help improve healthcare. Tyler was assigned to work in the secret lab, where he quickly realized that the technology didn't work as advertised. He saw how the company was diluting blood samples and using traditional machines instead of the revolutionary Edison devices that Elizabeth claimed to have invented. Tyler tried to raise his concerns within the company. He spoke to his supervisors and even tried to talk to Elizabeth directly. But instead of addressing the problems, the company tried to silence him. They moved him to different departments and eventually pushed him out of important meetings. Tyler faced a difficult choice. His grandfather was on the board of directors and believed strongly in Elizabeth and Theranos. If Tyler spoke out publicly, it could damage his relationship with his family and end his career before it started. But Tyler also knew that patients were being harmed by the company's lies. After months of internal struggle, Tyler made a brave decision. He decided to contact a journalist at the Wall Street Journal named John Carreyrou. Tyler knew that speaking to the press could result in serious legal consequences, but he felt he had no choice. John Carreyrou was an experienced investigative journalist who had won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. When Tyler first contacted him with claims about Theranos, John was skeptical. Elizabeth Holmes was one of the most celebrated entrepreneurs in America. Could she really be running a massive fraud? John began carefully investigating Tyler's claims. He reached out to other former Theranos employees and found several who were willing to speak anonymously about what they had seen. These whistleblowers confirmed Tyler's story and provided additional details about the company's deception. Meanwhile, Elizabeth learned that Tyler was talking to reporters. She was furious and immediately tried to stop him. She hired expensive lawyers to threaten Tyler with lawsuits. She even tried to turn his grandfather against him, telling George Shultz that Tyler was a disgruntled employee trying to damage the company. The pressure on Tyler was intense. His own grandfather stopped speaking to him. Theranos lawyers followed him and threatened him with financial ruin if he continued talking to the press. But Tyler refused to back down because he knew that patients' lives were at stake. John Carreyrou spent months verifying every detail of his investigation. He reviewed internal company documents, interviewed dozens of sources, and consulted with medical experts. He wanted to be absolutely certain of his facts before publishing such a serious accusation. On October 15, 2015, John Carreyrou published his explosive article in the Wall Street Journal. The headline read, "Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology." The article revealed that Theranos had been using traditional machines for most of its tests and that the company's revolutionary technology didn't actually exist. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Theranos' stock price collapsed. Investors who had put hundreds of millions of dollars into the company realized they had been deceived. Patients who had trusted Theranos with their health learned that their test results might be inaccurate. Elizabeth tried to fight back. She appeared on television shows and gave interviews denying the Wall Street Journal's reporting. She claimed that the article was full of lies and that jealous competitors were trying to destroy her company. She said that Theranos technology was real and would soon prove itself. But more whistleblowers came forward. More journalists began investigating the company. Government regulators started asking questions. The house of lies that Elizabeth had built for over a decade began to crumble rapidly. Within months, Walgreens ended its partnership with Theranos. Other business partners backed away. The famous politicians and business leaders on the board of directors quietly resigned. Elizabeth's fortune of over $4 billion disappeared as the company's value collapsed. Federal investigators began looking into Theranos operations. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigated whether Elizabeth had lied to investors. The Food and Drug Administration investigated whether the company had put patients at risk with inaccurate medical tests. Elizabeth hired some of the most expensive lawyers in America to defend her. She continued to insist that she had done nothing wrong and that her technology would eventually work. She blamed the problems on disgruntled employees and competitive jealousy from other companies. But the evidence against Elizabeth was overwhelming. Internal documents showed that she knew the technology didn't work as advertised. Emails revealed that she had knowingly made false claims to investors and patients. Former employees testified about the culture of deception within the company. In 2018, Elizabeth was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud. The government accused her of lying to investors to raise money and of putting patients at risk with fake medical tests. If convicted, she could face decades in prison. Elizabeth's trial began in 2021 and became one of the most watched criminal cases in Silicon Valley history. The trial revealed shocking details about how Elizabeth had maintained her deception for so many years. During her trial, Elizabeth tried several different defenses. First, she claimed that she really believed her technology would work and that she never intended to deceive anyone. She said she was just an optimistic entrepreneur who had made mistakes. When that defense didn't work, Elizabeth tried a different approach. She claimed that her boyfriend Sunny Balwani had controlled and abused her, forcing her to make decisions against her will. She testified that she had been a victim rather than the mastermind of the fraud. But the jury didn't believe Elizabeth's excuses. They heard testimony from patients who had received incorrect test results. They saw evidence that Elizabeth had knowingly made false claims about her technology. They learned how she had spent investors' money on personal luxuries while her company was failing. On January 3, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of fraud. The jury convicted her of lying to investors but acquitted her on charges related to deceiving patients. Even with the partial verdict, Elizabeth faced the possibility of decades in prison. On November 18, 2022, Elizabeth was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. The judge said that Elizabeth's crimes had been serious and that she needed to be held accountable for the harm she had caused. Elizabeth was also ordered to pay back millions of dollars to the investors she had deceived. The collapse of Theranos sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and the broader business world. Investors became more cautious about funding healthcare startups. Regulators increased oversight of medical device companies. The media began asking tougher questions about celebrated entrepreneurs and their claims. Many of the investors who had put money into Theranos lost everything. The famous politicians and business leaders who had served on the board faced embarrassment and criticism for not asking harder questions about the company's technology. The patients who had received inaccurate test results from Theranos filed lawsuits seeking compensation for the harm they had suffered. Many of these cases are still working their way through the courts. Tyler Leach, the whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the fraud, was eventually vindicated. His grandfather George Schultz apologized for not believing him earlier. Tyler became a symbol of the importance of speaking truth to power, even when it comes at a personal cost. John Carreyrou, the journalist who had investigated and exposed the fraud, won numerous awards for his reporting. He later wrote a book about the Theranos scandal called Bad Blood, which became a bestseller and was adapted into documentaries and movies. The story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos teaches us several important lessons about business, ethics, and human nature. First, it shows the danger of believing in charismatic leaders without demanding proof of their claims. Elizabeth was able to deceive investors, board members, and the media for years simply because she was confident and articulate. People wanted to believe her story so badly that they didn't ask the hard questions that might have exposed the fraud earlier. Second, the scandal highlights the importance of scientific integrity in healthcare. Medical devices and tests must be thoroughly proven to work before they are used on real patients. Elizabeth's willingness to put patients at risk for the sake of her business ambitions was not just unethical, it was criminal. Third, the story shows how corporate culture can enable fraud. Elizabeth created an environment where employees were afraid to speak up about problems. She used legal threats and intimidation to silence critics. This culture of fear allowed the deception to continue for years longer than it should have. Fourth, the scandal demonstrates the courage required to be a whistleblower. Tyler Leach and other former employees risked their careers and personal relationships to expose the truth about Theranos. Their bravery ultimately saved patients from further harm and brought justice to Elizabeth Holmes. Finally, the story reminds us that there are no shortcuts to genuine innovation. Elizabeth wanted the fame and fortune that comes with revolutionary breakthroughs, but she wasn't willing to do the hard work required to actually achieve them. Real scientific progress takes time, patience, and rigorous testing. Today, Elizabeth Holmes is serving her sentence in federal prison. The woman who was once celebrated as the youngest female billionaire in the world now wears a prison uniform instead of black turtlenecks. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of truth in business and science. Theranos officially shut down in 2018, and its assets were sold to pay back creditors. The company's offices in Palo Alto, which once bustled with hundreds of employees working on what they thought was revolutionary technology, now sit empty. The dream of making blood testing easier and more accessible was not necessarily a bad one. Other companies continue to work on improving medical diagnostics, but they do so with proper scientific rigor and regulatory oversight. The legitimate researchers working in this field have had to overcome the skepticism created by Elizabeth's fraud. For Silicon Valley, the Theranos scandal marked the end of an era of blind faith in young entrepreneurs making grand promises. Investors now demand more proof before funding healthcare startups. Journalists ask tougher questions about new technologies. Regulators keep closer watch on medical device companies. The story of Elizabeth Holmes reminds us that in business, as in life, there is no substitute for honesty, hard work, and genuine expertise. No amount of charisma or marketing can overcome the fundamental laws of science and physics. And no business success is worth the price of deceiving investors and endangering patients. In the end, Elizabeth Holmes got exactly what she always wanted. She became famous. But she became famous for all the wrong reasons, and her fame will forever be associated with one of the biggest corporate frauds in American history. Her story will be told for generations as an example of how not to build a business and how not to live a life. The victims of her fraud, the investors who lost their money and the patients who received incorrect medical information, deserve better. They trusted Elizabeth to tell the truth, and she betrayed that trust in pursuit of wealth and fame. That betrayal is ultimately what makes her story not just a business failure, but a human tragedy. This is the complete story of how a young woman's dreams of changing the world turned into a nightmare of deception, fraud, and broken trust, and how the truth eventually caught up with her lies.